Good evening. This is Maestro Cortello with a Dawn of War 2 Retribution Elite modcast. Today we have a 1v1 on Quest Heresy, and we have yet another match featuring Texcalibur, the famous sword of legend back to the Black Legion Sindri Trollface Chaos Sorcerer. The Chaos Sorcerer is a spell-casting hero, starts out with Doom Bolt to do damage. He can teleport as well. He can get some spells later on that allow him to manipulate his opponents with things like subjugation, as well as making units explode with the Curse of Tzeentch. On the other side, we have Asmondeus, playing as the Eldar Warlock. The Warlock is a very interesting hero as well. He has many different paths that he can use. He has a path that he can make him like a tanky melee hero, not much unlike the Force Commander. Or he can even actually go into a route that would actually make him a bit like the Sorcerer, believe it or not. Spellcasting, offensive spellcasting, as well as unit manipulation. So it's interesting. This is a revelation that I've had fairly recently, and it's one of the things I've actually always liked about the Warlock. That there's actually a lot of versatility out of the Warlock, a lot of variation in how you can choose to play him. More, in fact, than the Sorcerer. I mean, if you think about it, a unit like, say, the Force Commander it's pretty cut and dry, roughly what you're going to do with him and how you're going to use him. And the Warlock really is just interesting in that sense that he can really go off in different directions. It's hard to say what kind of hero is, since that really depends on how you want to use him and what you use with him. If you go for that Jedi build, which is the Merciless Witchblade, the Champion's Robe, as well as the Heart of Darkness, you're going for more of a Force Commander style of play, a tanky melee hero play. And then your goal really is to tie up, get him a lot of levels, and do a lot of damage with him. Now you can go a completely different route if you get war gears like the Immolator Blade, as well as Warp Throw. Then you're actually going with a play that is actually more like the Sorcerer. You have an offensive range spell with very long range that does damage, and you also have a manipulation spell, Warp Throw, which is something you use to control your opponent without actually doing damage. Manipulate, control, set up traps. So it's just very interesting that the Warlock just has that versatility of options that, to be honest, very few heroes probably have in this game. And I actually, back in retail, I used to play Eldar, and to the extent that I played Eldar, I mainly played the Warlock. So these two heroes are actually two of the heroes that I have a lot of experience playing. My Sorcerer is definitely better, but I did spend a lot of time in retail ranked playing as the Warlock. Now, between all of the choices that the Warlock has, there are definitely a lot of them that can potentially be very good against the Sorcerer. If you go for that tanky melee route, which it looks like Asmondeus is not going to go for, that's something that can be very good against the Sorcerer, since that is precisely one of the things that the Sorcerer struggles with. Tough, tanky, single entities that are trying to tie up your units. In particular, if you went for that Jedi build, that is something where Tex, in his current state, would not really have anything that could adequately and efficiently fight it. The heretics would largely just bleed models and feed levels to a Warlock who chose to get those war gears. The Chaos Space Marines would do some damage at ranged, but not enough to deter the Warlock from approaching. And then the Chaos Space Marines would also be bleeding and feeding levels, especially feeding even more levels if they actually bleed a model. And that's also a build that would be very good against the Sorcerer himself. The Sorcerer would lose that fight if the Warlock went for the Merciless Witchblade. And he would also be bleeding energy as well, which is exactly what you don't want as the Sorcerer, since the Sorcerer is very energy intensive. Now, that being said, Asmondeus has not gone for that build, so he doesn't. Tex won't necessarily have to worry about that. And at least in the Warlock's vanilla form, one of the easier things about the Warlock compared to, say, the Force Commander is that in the Warlock's vanilla form, he actually isn't that much more powerful than the Sorcerer as a melee fighter, and at least to start out in the early stages of the game, you can have the Sorcerer head-to-head fight the Warlock. And if you have the Sorcerer with an upgraded weapon, while the Warlock doesn't, then the Sorcerer would actually win in a melee fight over the Warlock. Now, of course, in the long-term potential of the game, what war gears are available, the Warlock would still be better just as a melee fight, but just depending on what war gears you get, as well as just in general, it's generally going to be easier and more practical to tie up a hero like the Warlock with the Sorcerer than it would be against the Force Commander. So Asmon has chosen to get that Immolator Blade, and we've already been seeing that used to great effect against the Heretics. It's just an area of effect fire ability that's going to have a lot of versatility against, basically against Chaos, against the Sorcerer, and against the Heretics. Particularly, it can be used at long range to dislodge Heretic worship, and especially Tzeentch worship, which you can't see, you can't target them normally, but you don't need to target a unit with the Immolator Blade, and that would actually be something that would be just very good for getting them to move, forcing off one squad of Heretics. The Warlock in general is very good as an anti-Heretic unit with any of his weapon upgrades. The Immolator Blade being something that's very good early on, just bleeding Heretic models, denying an area. If the Heretics try to swarm him, he can use it right on himself, and he will take minimal damage. I actually don't remember if the Immolate ability on that weapon does friendly fire, but even if it does, he'll take minimal damage while the Heretic models are just dying. And of course, the Merciless Witchblade is very good just in terms of how much damage it does. We'll usually bleed a Heretic model with almost every strike. Oh, but there we have a dead Warlock. And then the Witchblade of Kurnos, which is a tier 2 weapon. That's something that would be extremely good against Heretics as well, since they would really not even be able to, fight the Warlock at all. So the Warlock himself is very, very good as a Heretic deterrent. Both a deterrent and a way of just straight up wiping Heretics or forcing them off the field. It's also a great source of experience for the Warlock. Oh, this is really, really bad. So Tex not quite responding there. One of the things, obviously, when you have grenades, which are it's a very powerful ability, but good players will often just micro out of grenades, much in the way good players will micro away from Doom Bolts. So one of the things that good players will often do to maximize the use out of things like Doom Bolts or grenades is combining it with suppression. That's one of Chaos Librarian's signatures, using a Havoc to combine with suppression so that he can have every single Doom Bolt hitting his target. In that case, we saw suppression on a Havoc squad. A grenade went in, the Havoc could not just run out of it, and because Tex didn't retreat, he actually lost the Havoc squad entirely from that grenade. Now, in addition, just with all the Heretic deterrent things that the Warlock gets, he also, of course, starts out with that Destructor ability. Now, the Destructor ability is not quite going to have the versatility of Immolate, because you can't use it as effectively if Heretics are worshipping. The spread there will actually save the Heretics from most of the damage, and you also can't see them. But the good thing is, when the Heretics are just walking around normally, one Destructor will pretty much force off a single Heretic squad. Now, Tex has 3 Heretic squads, and I was a little surprised to see him get that, considering everything I've just said about the Warlock and his ability to deter Heretics. But I think what Tex might just be thinking here is that Heretics are, even as good as the Warlock is at deterring the Heretics, Heretics are still very useful, and I think very essential in this matchup, particularly for dealing with Banshees. You want Heretics, and you probably ideally want multiple Heretics for dealing with Banshees, especially if they're not going to have an aspiring champion. Although, I'm assuming that if Tex had actually gotten only 1 or even 2 Heretics, he also would have gotten an aspiring champion. Now, on Asmon's side, we see that he has gone for a double Shuriken play, and this is something it's been very common with Eldar for a very long time, at least for as long as I've been playing, which is basically as long as Retribution has been out. It's a common build because one of the things, first of all, the Shuriken team is just, it seems to be a little bit better than many of the other setup teams. Well, these Shurikens are even level 2, but one of the good things about Shurikens is that they actually do decent damage relative to other weapons teams, as well as having good suppression as well. They also, I think, complement the Eldar army, where both the Howling Banshees and the Dire Avengers, they're units that you don't really want to just run up front to your enemy, because they will either lose outright or they will bleed disproportionately because their models are so much more expensive. And expensive relative to their survivability compared to other races with similar survivability, or just not as survivable as units like Chaos Space Marines and such. So basically, if you just have a normal ranged unit like Dire Avengers facing another normal ranged unit, they will have to take damage to deal damage, because they will be getting shot at while they're getting shot at. The Guardian Weapon Team prevents this because of suppression. That's a sense where the Guardian Weapon Team does not have to take damage to deal damage. And having 2 of those Guardian Weapons teams just gives you a lot of fire support to allow your Dire Avengers and your Howling Banshees to either get in or just do their damage without taking damage from your opponent, which is a way that just complements the Eldar army a little bit better, since you ideally really just don't want Dire Avengers taking damage. Banshees will, of course, inevitably take damage, but you don't want them to take any damage until they actually get into the fight. Asmon, I think, here is going to lose another squad of Howling Banshees. So, not such good losses from him right there. Now, as for how you deal with this double Guardian Weapon Team play, of course, another way of using the Guardian Weapon Team, especially, or using any suppression team when you have 2 of them, is to give them overlapping arcs of fire, so that you are covering one weapon team with the other. That is useful against jump units, since if a jump unit jumps in on one weapon team, they will start getting suppressed by the other. That's something that's actually a risk for the Sorcerer in this matchup, teleporting in on Guardian weapon teams. The fact that he could be teleporting right into the arc of another Shuriken, not to mention a squad of Howling Banshees, although Asmon does not have those anymore. But he could still potentially jump right into the arc of another squad, of another Guardian weapon team. Or in this case, we now have a Bright Lance. But assuming that Asmon still had 2 Guardian weapon teams, one of the great ways the Sorcerer can deal with that is, of course, the Sigil of the Rift. And at this point, it's pretty well known that the Sigil of the Rift is a very hard counter to 2 setup teams, and that you can wipe a setup team outright using the Sigil of the Rift. But the reason it's so useful against Eldar in particular, or whenever you're playing against an opponent who gets 2 setup teams or 2 suppression teams, is the fact that it doesn't carry the risk of jumping in, because instead of jumping in, you're pulling the setup team out. So you're not jumping into that second Shuriken's firing arc, or you're not jumping into that squad of Howling Banshees, which is definitely one of the risks of using a jump unit against Eldar, and it's also just one of the ways that Eldar plays. Guardian weapons teams are actually themselves used as baits for other Guardian weapons teams to do their damage, or for Howling Banshees to have a squad come to them, since one of the risks of using Howling Banshees is that they take too much damage trying to get to the opponent. Instead, you bring the melee squad to the Howling Banshees. So the Sigil of the Rift bypasses that. It is, of course, an option that no other commander has. You pull out that first setup team, that first Guardian weapon team, and then that leaves the second Guardian weapon team open to being jumped at a relatively lower risk. Of course, there is still the potential of those Howling Banshees, not in this case, but just in general, how I actually approach Eldar is, if they get 2 Guardian weapons teams, I get the Sigil of the Rift. In fact, often I get the Sigil of the Rift, period, against Eldar. If not for dealing with that second Guardian weapon team than the fact that I don't want my Sorcerer or my Raptors jumping into Banshees. Now, the Warlock has been upgraded with the Warp Throw. That is one of the Warlock signature abilities, and Asmon is very, very good with that. He likes to combine it with Autarch call-ins, which is actually very, very tricky. That's one of the... It's strange, because I think it's both one of the trickiest combinations with the Warp Throw, and also, in Elite Mod, I think one of the least rewarding. Since the Autarch grenades do less damage in Elite Mod, I think it's better combined with either Howling Banshees or Dire Avenger grenades. Of course, the ideal combination is actually in Tier 3, combining it with either an Avatar or an Eldritch Storm. But you still get a lot of utility out of Warp Throw in Tier 2, combining it with, basically just combining it with what I said, the Dire Avenger grenades, Howling Banshees, or in this case, we can even have it combined with Seer Council. And he seems to be getting Seer Council, I think, because he lost 2 squads of Howling Banshees. He still wants that same kind of melee superiority, but at this point he can actually get Seer Council instead of Howling Banshees. And the Seer Council really do function very similarly to the Howling Banshees. I guess the main thing is just that they don't have they don't have the War Shout ability, so they can't suppress. But otherwise, they function very similarly in terms of their speed, how powerful they are. And given their higher DPS overall, they probably not even any worse against vehicles than a Howling Banshee squad with the aspect of strength. Oh, it's a trap! It's a trap! That's really bad. I could see that not going well with those Seer Council going right into a squad of, or not a squad, but going right into that Chaos Dreadnought, now getting hit by some Sonic Blaster Noise Marine, or Blastmaster Noise Marine. But yeah, the Chaos Dreadnought is very good as a melee counter. Very risky against most Tier 3 melee units, because Tier 3 melee units are often heavy melee units. Unfortunately for the Seer Council, they do not have heavy melee. They can still be used somewhat as AV just because their base DPS is so high. 40 per model on a 5-man squad, which comes out to 200 DPS power melee, and if 15% of that is going through, that means they're still doing about 30 DPS to vehicles, and if you think about that, that's actually comparable to a Adrenal Gland Warrior Brood. Which actually, now that I think about it, would definitely be less than a squad of Aspect of Strength Howling Banshees, but still, just one of the things I often like to remind people about, that power melee isn't necessarily useless against vehicles, because some of the damage actually does go through, and a lot of power melee squads often happen to just have very high base DPSs. So even though power melee only does 15%, 15% of a very large number is often still enough to do some soft AV. We have some Corrin Chaos Space Marines again from Tex. Now, the Corrin Chaos Space Marines are awesome. I've said this before, and this is actually potentially really, really bad for the Fire Prism. And the Fire Prism, I was actually... Right now, it's not really a great choice, although this is a very bad situation for Tex. He already just burned the teleport on his Chaos Terminators, and they just got into melee with some Seer Council. Luckily for him, he's got a Chaos Dreadnought to offer some support, but I think Tex is going to lose at least one model. He might still lose the Chaos Terminators, but he does use the Warp Global to get them out of there. I think that was a little bit of a mistake by Tex, a little zealously jumping or teleporting the Chaos Terminators in so that they could chase down that Fire Prism, although he did eventually get the Fire Prism. So in that case, actually, it was worth it. there we see that Immolate, even scaling into the late game, as long as heretics are around, although at this point, Tex has really de-emphasized his heretics. Oh my god, oh wow, he loses one. Actually, he lost 2 models. The last 2 models died from range fire to the Dire Avengers. I thought they were just barely going to get out of there. But Tex he has de-emphasized the use of his heretics somewhat. He has actually, the way he's been using them he really actually has not been using his heretics for fighting that much. It's very interesting to see that. And I guess part of the reason is that he hasn't had to use them against Asmon's Howling Banshees that much, since Asmon has been a little careless with his Banshees and lost his Banshees to things that weren't even heretics. So Tex has been running around with heretics, often at partial models. We have a 4 out of 8 model heretic squad right here. We had another one before that only had... There was the time when he sent them all out with only 5 models. So he's been using them a lot more for map control, and I think especially since he got this Chaos Dreadnought, that's really been what he's been using to fight right now. And I feel like I don't even know what I've seen out of his Chaos Sorcerer. He does now have the Tome of Subjugation, however. And this is a game that Asmon has recently uploaded several games of him versus Tex. He won several of them. This one is, to be honest, it's a game where he's had a little bit of trouble. He's lost some squads unnecessarily, although he is trying to come back into it. Oh! That autarch. Alright, it's not looking good for Asmon. He's very low on resources. Now, it is also... I thought it was a little curious to see him go for a Fire Prism. I guess it certainly would have been very good against the Heretics. Would have contained the Sorcerer, as well as allowing him to control those Corncast Space Marines, which are certainly pretty dangerous, although I think the Seer Council can take them. But it would actually just be interesting to see, and possibly even very effective, to see him try to go for an Avatar to combine that with Warp Throw, since that's something where you can really potentially take out a single squad, with a given use of that. As it is, his best combination for Warp Throw would probably be the Seer Council. And Asmon is actually still holding on to this very, very well, but he just had his Seer Council subjugated. But Asmon is keeping this... He's been keeping this VP, holding his own, obviously, and then having a suppression team guard this side VP. But it's in a lot of trouble now, about to get chased down by some Corncast Space Marines. This could be the end of this Guardian weapon team, and it's very lucky that it could get into that Webway Gate, because I think without that Webway Gate, that would have been a wipe on the Guardian weapon team. Now, unfortunately, that's probably going to send the game into Tex's favor. He's actually going for decap on Asmon's Natural. And I think Asmon has been staying in this game a lot based on basically holding this side VP. A lot of the fighting is congregated in the middle, so he was able to hold that side VP a lot on the power of that Guardian weapon team, just halting approaches by single units that are trying to just go off to the side and cap that point, whereas most of the units are going down the middle to fight. And that's something that often happens, just the way a lot of people play. People generally tend to, most of the fighting will congregate in a certain area of the map, usually in the center, and then people will usually only send like maybe one unit at a time, a capping unit, sometimes not a very powerful unit, to go for a side VP or some kind of side point. So, and then just based on those habits, now this is a habit, it is not an inherent feature of the game, it is a habit that players have.
Based on that, that habit is easily countered by having a unit like a suppression team protect a side point. We had a lot of death right there. A whole Terminator squad went down. Unfortunately, Tex had tried to teleport them out. One Terminator model teleported out and then died, whereas the last one that didn't die just stayed in there against the Seer Council. And the Seer Council themselves lost quite a few models. How much do they... And they cost quite a bit to reinforce, a fortune to reinforce. But at this point, it looks like the game is about to go in favor of Tex, the famous Sword of Legend. About to get a triple cap.
Their shelter was too. Chaos vanquishes all.
All right, and that is the end of the game. Now, Asmon, he had played several games with Tex, several of which he actually did post, and several of which he won. Only the ones he lost seem to be getting cast, but those were the better games. In any case, hope you enjoyed the cast. Have a good night.